First, it was food, then the crackdown moved to cosmetics. And now, Bengaluru's Food Safety and Drug Administration has uncovered something far more serious, an alleged counterfeit medicine racket. A raid in Bidadi has brought the spotlight onto a question that affects every patient, every family. When you buy a medicine from a pharmacy, how certain are you that the medicine inside the vial is actually what the label says it is? On August 18, the Drug Enforcement Wing of the Food Safety and Drug Administration conducted a surprise raid at a farmhouse in Kurubarahalli near Bidadi in Ramanagara district. What the officials say they found, there was not a conventional pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. It was allegedly an unlicensed repacking and relabeling operation. According to the preliminary investigation, lower cost medicines were being procured from other states. These medicines were allegedly being transferred into new vials, repackaged and then given labels designed to make them appear to be expensive medicines manufactured by major multinational pharmaceutical companies. Among the labels seized during the raid were those carrying the name Pfizer. The alleged operation, according to officials, was essentially about changing the identity of the medicine before it reached the market. And that is what makes this case particularly alarming. Because a counterfeit medicine is not simply a cheaper version of a branded drug, officials say such medicine may contain no active pharmaceutical ingredient, the wrong ingredient, or potentially harmful substances. That means the danger isn't only that a consumer could lose money, a patient could believe they are receiving a particular treatment when in reality they may not be receiving the medicine they were prescribed at all. And in the case of critical illness, that difference can have serious consequences. The enforcement operation resulted in the seizure of medicine, equipments and other material valued approximately 4.91 crore. And the list of seized material gave us an idea of the scale of the alleged operation. Officials seized 5,640 vials of Seizure 2.5 injection. The approximate value assigned to this stock alone was more than 3.38 crore. Another 1,531 vials of Islam injection were seized, valued over 52 lakh. There were also 470 vials of Zavitas injection, 464 vials of Imblavio carrying a Pfizer label, 165 vials of Zavisecta and several other injectable medicines. Officials also seized 30 boxes of expired medicines, and then there was the infrastructure. An injection filling unit was seized from the premises. Along with that came packaging materials, stoppers and caps, fake labels and stamps. In other words, investigators say this was not simply a case of someone storing questionable medicine. The presence of filling equipment and packaging material has raised concern that medicines been actively repacked and prepared for distribution. The authorities also noticed something else. The scanning codes printing on the labels reportedly did not work. That is now part of the investigation as officials try to establish exactly how the medicines were being represented and where they were intended to go. What happens to the medicine now? The seized stock has not simply been taken away and stored. Samples have been sent to a government laboratory. The test will determine the chemical composition, purity and potency of the medicines. Officials also examine whether the medicine is sterile and whether they contain the ingredient they are supposed to contain. That distinction is important. At this stage, the authorities have described the operation as involving suspicious and counterfeit medicine, but laboratory testing will help establish exactly what was inside the seized product. The department has also taken steps to prevent the seized stock from entering the market. The batch numbers and entries of the seized drug have been blocked on the FDA portal. The stated purpose is to prevent further sale or distribution. A criminal complaint has also been registered at the Tavarkar police station. The police and the regulatory authorities are now conducting a joint investigation. The Bidadi raid is significant not just because of 4.91 crore seizures. It shows how the enforcement focus in Bengaluru is expanding. Over the past few weeks, the Food Safety and Drug Administration has been moving across different parts of the consumer health chain. It started with food. During the inspection of hotels and food establishments, officials found expired and mislabeled products, poor storage of meat and poultry, unhygienic kitchen, mold-affected vegetables, and problem with the segregation of vegetarian and non-vegetarian food. More than 1,000 of unsafe or non-compliant food articles were seized during one of these drives. Officials also collected dozens of food samples for laboratory testing. The inspection did not stop with smaller establishments. Major food chains and their supplying warehouses were also inspected. Then came cosmetics. Following direction of the health minister, the department began collecting cosmetic samples for scrutiny, including products such as lipsticks. So the trajectory is quite clear. First, what Bengaluru eats, then what Bengaluru put on its skin, and now what Bengaluru puts into its body as medicine. But there is an important difference. With food and cosmetic, contamination of poor quality can pose serious risk. With medicine, the risk can be even more direct. A person buying an injection is doing so because they expect the medicine to contain a specific drug at a specific strength, product under controlled condition. If the product has been illegally repackaged, falsely labeled, or contain the wrong ingredient, the patient has no reliable way of knowing what they are actually receiving. And that brings us to the bigger question raised by this raid. How does a product like this potentially moved from an illegal facility to the patient? That is something investigators will now have to establish. Where were these medicines sourced? Who supplied them? Who was responsible for the repackaging? Where were the fake labels printed? Which distributed pharmaceuticals or hospitals, if any, were these products intended for? And most importantly, did any of these medicines actually enter the market? The FDA has already blocked the identified batches, but the investigation will now have to trace the supply chain to determine whether any of the suspected counterfeit product had already been distributed. That is also why laboratory testing is crucial. If the samples are found to contain incorrect ingredient, insufficient active ingredient, or harmful substances, the implication become even more serious. The authorities have also evoked provisions of the Drug and Cosmetic Act 1940. Under the Act, counterfeit and suspicious drugs are treated as serious offense. The manufacture, sale, storage, or distribution of such medicines can attract severe punishments. Officials have indicated that the seized stock will be produced before the appropriate court as the investigation proceeds. So this is no longer simply a regulatory inspection. It has now become a criminal investigation into an alleged illegal pharmaceutical operation. There is also a broader issue here. The entire healthcare system depends on trust. When a doctor writes a prescription, the patient trusts that the medicine available at the pharmacy is genuine. When pharmacy sells an injection, the patient assumes that the product has been manufactured, stored, and distributed according to the required standard. And when the label carries the name of a major pharmaceutical company, consumers generally have no reason to believe that the label itself could be fake. That is precisely why counterfeit medicine can be so dangerous. The average consumer is not equipped to examine an injection vial and determine whether the contents are genuine. They cannot test its chemical composition. They cannot determine its potency. And they certainly cannot know whether the product was legally manufactured. That responsibility lies with the regulatory system and the pharmaceutical supply chain. For investigators, the immediate priorities are clear. First, determine what exactly was inside the seized medicines. Second, establish where the medicines came from. Third, Find out how they were repackaged and labeled. Fourth, identify where they were supposed to go. And finally, determine whether any counterfeit medicine had already reached patients. The authorities have already blocked the identified batches and launched the investigation. But the real test will be whether investigators can trace the entire network behind the operation. Because shutting down one farmhouse is one thing. Finding the people who supplied the medicine, created the labels, moved the products, and potentially connected them to the market is another. And that is where this case could become much bigger. So, Bengaluru's latest crackdown has now moved through three stages: food, cosmetics, medicine. First two drives raised concern about what consumers were eating and using. The Bidadi raids raised much more fundamental question. What if the medicine you trust isn't actually the medicine you think it is? The seizure of medicines and materials worth nearly 4.91 crores suggests that the alleged operation was not insignificant. But the value of the seizure is not only one part of the story. The more important question is whether any of these suspected counterfeit medicine made it into the hands of the patient. That is what the laboratory reports, the police investigation, and the tracing of the alleged supply chain will now have to establish. Until then, one thing is clear: Bengaluru's food and drug safety crackdown has entered a new and far more serious phase. From checking what's on your plate to what's on your skin, and now what's inside the medicine vial.